Walt Disney presents...
May I have your autograph, please,
Sure.
Mr. Disney?
Here you are.
Thank you.
Ooh. Well, it looks like I'm stuck here, so why don't you go on without me, and I'll be catching up with you somewhere along the line.
Is animation just for children? Let me answer this straight away. No, of course not. I'd like to say anyone can tell you that, but it's not true. This video is more about tracing the origins of the idea and seeing really where it stems from. Why is it so deeply rooted in the Western psyche still? Honestly, I think it stems from one man, Walt Disney. You know, in researching this, I just could not escape the gravitational pull that his effect had on the entire industry. He was there from the beginning and influenced not just the West, but global animation as well. And once his films hit the foreign markets, you can see the influence seep into some of the earliest global animation. Disney was such a powerful voice, and the company has never let go of its vice grip on Western animation. It still constantly fights a battle to remain at the very forefront of it. Even when Walt passed away in 1966, his personal influence stayed on all the animators that grew with him through the studio's development, and to be honest, across animation, leading up until now. When we think of Western animation today, to be honest, it's generally CG, sure, for features, but even amongst the different styles, what you find is a grounding of real-world elements. There's definitive weight to how things move, real limitation in the physics, even in more experimental work. And despite the style, it's generally humanoid, with creatures that walk and talk. It's not this. And, you know, I just want to say, animation doesn't really need physics. We add it because it's kind of what we're used to seeing. Back in animation's infancy, there was a much more malleable approach to how the world could work. The animators' imaginations were very experimental. Their limbs could stretch and change form for what they're needed. But more and more, the studios angle toward realism. And today, that realism is what makes up most of animation. Disney's artists were really unparalleled in their study for realism. In fact, Walt brought in teachers from all different disciplines and put them into school to study a wide variety of art styles.
First thing I did when I got a little money to experiment, I put all my artists back in school. The art schools that existed then didn't quite have enough for what we needed, so we set up our own art school. But we were just going a little bit beyond what they were getting in the art school, where they work with a static figure. Now, we were dealing in motion, movement, the flow of movement, the flow of things, you know, action, reaction, all of that. So we had to set up our own school.
They used their silly symphonies to experiment and push animation natural steps forward, experimenting with creating depth and three-dimensional movement, synchronized sound, color, camera movements that mimic the real world, pushing towards semblances of photorealistic backgrounds. And it all culminated in the blockbuster hit Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937. Considering the difference of 9 years earlier, you can see how far they had come. And to be honest, I think the driving force was all in service of storytelling, to give the audience something to connect with.
He was the best story man in the studio, and nobody even approached him.
Abstraction can sometimes be alienating, and Walt Disney cared a lot about entertaining, so it was important that his stories connected with the audiences.
I'm not labeling anything as educational. It's all entertainment.
Now, that's not to say there was no abstraction in the original Disney movies.
Walt was always wanting to push the envelope of what animation could do. In a film like Bambi, he's clearly pushing naturalism to a degree that no one has matched since in animation, and it's unlikely anyone ever will.
The first 5 features developed were all wildly experimental. I mean, they were lavish, testing out personality, testing effects, even realistic motion over backgrounds that give you the feeling of truth, the feeling of being there, rather than just the scrupulous details. Even wild abstraction was experimented with. Taking influences from anywhere that could serve the story.
He's still experimenting and exploring and looking for, okay, where can we take this?
We often think of Disney features being just fairy tales, but the popularity of those stories kind of came later. Actually, what you see at the start is someone pushing the envelope and seeing what animation could do. In Fantasia, for example, the Ave Maria sequence has one of the most elaborate film shots in animation history. It was filmed continuously by a collection of 9 men over 6 full days and nights. They laid out a horizontal multiplane camera across a 150-foot length of the Disney soundstage just to capture this.
20 years before Pinocchio, you were looking at stick figures and rubber hose princesses and these little vaudevillian Mickey Mouses wandering around the screen in black and white, drawn with a quarter and 2 nickels. It was a really primitive art form, and these guys moved the art form ahead to Pinocchio. I mean, that's a big journey.
So we know that even with the experimentation, the fundamental core of Disney animation was to create stories through characters and a narrative, which has led to how the animation landscape is dominated today. Paul Wells wrote that Disney's concentration on innovations ultimately had the consequence of undermining the distinct aspects of animation itself. With each technological development, Disney moved further away from the plasmatic flexibility of many of the early silly symphonies and coerced the animation form into a neo-realistic practice. To be honest, their rules still define the principles of animation. Now, it's not the only aspect of Disney films. You probably might be asking yourself, what about the family-friendly content?
Hey, Pumbaa, not in front of the kids.
Oh, sorry.
Well, I'll get back to that. I just want to explore another contributor first. You remember Saturday morning cartoons, yeah? I do. I remember loving them so much. I think a lot of my early exposure to animation was through Saturday morning cartoons and having Disney films on VHS. It's an interesting story how they developed. Like everything else, before TV was the radio, and the radio really developed segments for children's broadcasting. It was usually after school between 4 to 6 p.m. and Saturday mornings between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m. When TV started broadcasting, it began taking a lot of cues from radio, including the children's broadcasting hours. Back then, most animation was still in production for a theatrical release, but it did slowly shift toward TV. And one of the first animated TV series made specifically for TV was Crusader Rabbit in 1949. Now, it was pretty crude, but it led the way for more TV-specific animation. I have to really say that it wasn't just made for children. The satirical nature of shows like Crusader Rabbit were aimed at a more developed mind, let's say. And we can't forget that other animated shows aired on prime time. The cartoons shifted into the children's slots later.
People think of Bugs Bunny as a kid's cartoon, but if they do any homework at all, they realize the cartoons were made for adults who were about to see the next Humphrey Bogart film or the next Bette Davis film. They were not made for kids. They had enough slapstick in them that kids could enjoy them. But it wasn't until the 50s when television needed kids' entertainment that they had all these cartoons that kids would sit still for and watch. That they started thinking of it as primarily a children's children's medium, and it isn't. It just isn't.
Animation in the 60s was becoming a children's medium as more of the cartoons are really slotted in that time frame. And then when the 80s hit with the free market, it really punched us through the TVs. Because of the development of animation being aired as a Saturday morning show in the children's time slot, the children's market was cornered to that specific time. So cartoons became a great way to sell toys.
We have Ripster, we have Slobster, and we have Killamari.
And a lot of late 80s and early 90s shows were literally only being made to sell toys. That was their primary purpose. And in fact, He-Man was the first cartoon made based on toys just to sell it.
But the subtle message that's being sent is obvious. Buy me. Buy me.
And while there was an explosion of animation, the association of heavy toy branding really damaged the idea that animation could be anything else but for kids.
People other than cartoonists create a toy and then basically try to have a cartoon made about the toy, because that's a running commercial.
Sadly, the opportunity to create new art or explore animation in different ways got lost in the mire of capitalism.
Saturday morning could be the greatest place in the world for cartoonists to operate out of. Saturday morning could be the hugest delight on television. Saturday morning could be so great it could be put on Saturday night.
Don't get me wrong, I love the explosion of work, and to be honest, those shows that I grew up with, I treasure as icons of my time. And I think this is actually where I want to return to Walt Disney, and really the crux of the idea that animation is thought of for children in the West, really, still to this day. Although there were market forces involved, why cartoons were viewed as a safe viewing space really originally comes from him. And to be honest, his need to escape.
Walt had a pretty tough childhood. He had worked on a farm, he had delivered newspapers when it was 25 degrees below, and yet he believed in the Hollywood dream, the American dream.
I was about 9 or 10 when I started that they deliver our papers at 4:30, that we had to get up and be there at 4:30 in the morning.
If you look at the earlier work of Walt, there's always that hint of escapism. With the original Alice shorts, the little girl goes into the animated world, rather than other tropes like Coco the Clown entering our world. She escapes our reality. With the Silly Symphonies, it's primarily farm animals and nature dancing and singing, reminiscent of a time Disney considers to be his purest, on the farm when he was younger. As he was developing his features, these fantastic stories and fairy tales always drew his attention. The innocent child who goes out into the world loses their innocence, but never loses their dream. Mickey Mouse was often considered an alter ego of Walt. Even through the way he himself talks about Mickey, it feels like he's talking about himself.
Too many taboos put onto Mickey Mouse. People didn't feel that Mickey could blow his top like the duck. In other words, he had to maintain a certain dignity.
He even voiced Mickey Mouse originally because he couldn't find anyone else that was doing the tone correctly.
Yeah, it's me, I guess.
The way he talks about Mickey and the story of his origin, to be honest, sounds a lot like Walt's start.
First time I met Mickey, he was a hungry-looking young mouse playing in his first movie. He was so poor that he didn't even own a pair of shoes.
When the animators' strike hit in 1941, he felt greatly hurt by his staff in the animation field. But I just want to say, to be fair, he really did deserve it. The wages were awful, and there was an imbalance of treatment in the company. It was catastrophic. Here's actually a recording of him talking to the staff just before they all went on strike.
I have always felt, and always will feel, that the men who contribute the most to the organization should, out of respect alone, enjoy some privileges. If you're not progressing as you should, instead of grumbling and growling, do something about it.
He could be pretty ruthless, you know? But I think what happened here is his once beloved escape into animation didn't feel safe anymore. So over the following years, you can see him search again and again for that new escape. He tried live action and documentaries for some release, but I think through all the interviews I've seen with him and all the home footage, it was spending the time with his kids and family that he admitted little ideas trickled into his head. He began building model trains to escape from the pressures of everything else around him, the pressure of being Walt Disney. And he became so fascinated with the physical escape he could step into, well, really sit on. New ideas started to take shape.
But it all started from a daddy with 2 daughters wondering where he could take them, where he could have a little fun with them too.
And that led to Disneyland, the happiest place on earth, where he was king. Sure, he still supervised each animated feature, of course, but he really drifted away from it quite far, leaving it to Bill Pete to basically storyboarding and develop most of the ideas, allowing the famous 9 old men run the productions effectively, so he could focus on Disneyland. The joy of mechanics led to his interest in developing audio animatronics, which led to the development of Epcot, an experimental prototype city of tomorrow, and Disney World.
That was always the exciting thing about working at the studio. You never knew what was coming up next, and Walt was always miles ahead of you.
He crafted the persona of Uncle Walt, the guy you saw on Walt Disney's Wonderful World, serving as an advertisement for Disneyland and future projects, but also to showcase who he was, or who he wanted you to think he was.
He understood instinctively how to get publicity, how to fascinate people. He was a great storyteller, and a lot of the stories he told were about Walt, so it's just the way he was.
But he did admit to being restricted to the idea of himself that he had created.
I'm not Walt Disney, he once told a friend. I do a lot of things Walt Disney wouldn't do. Walt Disney doesn't smoke, I smoke. Walt Disney doesn't drink, I drink.
The more he solidified himself as a brand, the ideals he stood for, certainly he felt his hands tied by the stories he could tell.
He invited Diane and I over to watch a film. The film was To Kill a Mockingbird. He said, boy, that was a hell of a picture. I wish I could make a picture like that. And you could feel that he felt restricted in how far he could go.
You're going to see the happy ending. You're going to see a film or a theme park or a place to go where it shows the hope of the human spirit excelling and winning at the end of the day, because that's who he was.
A man like Walt Disney is very rare in the world. Despite his shortcomings with work relations, to be honest, he was a genius. A visionary master, and who knows where the world would be if he hadn't passed away in 1966. For a man who dreamed all the time, pushing his dream at the end towards space travel, he didn't even get to see the moon landing. The last animated feature he worked on, The Jungle Book, he took a lot of creative control over, and he admitted to his guys.
He said to them, gee guys, I had forgotten how much fun this is.
Now just imagine if he'd turned his focus back on the animation studio. Where would we be now? Animation was both blessed and cursed by his touch, in the sense that he poured his genius into furthering the art form. But it spluttered to a stop when he left, and it hasn't really dramatically moved on since. All the fundamentals that everyone uses were developed through the early days in Disney. But one thing I don't think would have changed is that idea of escape into a better world.
Over at our place, we're sure of just one thing. Everybody in the world was once a child. So when planning a new picture, we don't think of grown-ups and we don't think of children, but just of that fine, clean, unspoiled spot down deep in every one of us that maybe the world has made us forget and that maybe our pictures can help recall.
There's a wonderful quote from the voice actor of Bambi where he said,
"Films like Bambi allow the children to be children before they got biased and hammered with all the things that we experience in adulthood."
Even Sergei Eisenstein, who developed a lot of the language of film and cinema, wrote that watching Disney's work must have been what it was like to witness St. Francis of Assisi's sermons, because, and I quote, "Disney's work themselves strike me as the same kind of drop of comfort, an instant relief, a fleeting touch in the hell of social burdens, injustices, and torments in which the circle of his American viewers are forever trapped." Is it such a bad thing that the goal of Disney was to bring you back to that comfort, that safe place where you just felt secure, warm, and loved? It's probably the reason why it still connects with so many adults. Beyond smart and honest plots, it takes you back to, well, Takes you back to that cottage in France. And that's a wonderful thing, that moment of escape. The problem is, it's not all animation can be, and the bias attached to the medium is just so heavy it can choke it creatively. An animated feature is expensive, and sure, it's safer just to aim at the broadest possible target audience, but it just keeps shoveling dirt onto the grave of animation's potential. It is so much more than just feeling safe. That's a wonderful Disney idea. You have to remember, animation can be anything it wants to be, if you let it. Hi everyone, thank you so much for watching as always, I really appreciate it. It's just me with my little epilogue. There is a lot of incredible animation out there that is really pushing forward, and thankfully mainstream is really starting to pick up on it. Things like Into the Spider-Verse or Klaus. It's wonderful to see. Thank you to my Patreons. Your continued support means the world to me. It actually blows my mind that people want to support this channel. And if anybody else wants to get involved, there is of course a link in the description below. See you next time.